Owen and Mark, thanks for joining Spectator TV. Owen, you write the cover piece for this week's magazine about the possibility of a so-called peace deal in Ukraine. Tell us about recent reports that suggest that something could be in the works.
Well, first and foremost, let's be very clear. We're not talking about a peace deal. We're talking about a ceasefire. And those are actually two very really important things. I think a ceasefire is something that Putin has reportedly, and I know personally the reporters that worked on this for the New York Times who reported it on 23rd of December, and they have very good sources. And their information is that there have been unofficial back-channel feelers from the Kremlin to senior officials in Washington to discuss the possibility of a ceasefire, not necessarily a peace deal, but a ceasefire, essentially freezing the conflict along the line of control. And I find that pretty plausible, actually, because that kind of deal, that kind of arrangement, that kind of ceasefire allows Putin to sort of lock in a situation on the ground that he hopes is going to become a sort of de facto eventual partition of Ukraine. But the point of my piece this week is that although Putin putting out peace feelers or wanting to talk is not necessarily news, what's really news is that I think what US policymakers are starting to realize is that one essential ingredient of any kind of eventual ceasefire or post-war arrangement or end game or wherever you like to call it is essentially dividing Ukraine and allowing Putin to keep the part that he's already occupied. And that comes with enormous moral hazard and practical problems.
Mark, do you agree with Owen's characterization of Putin's thinking? After the Christmas assault on Ukraine, can we take these calls seriously?
We can, because it's for entirely pragmatic reasons. Look, on the one hand, Putin clearly has a wider goal of actually wanting to essentially subordinate Ukraine, remove it from being part of, as he sees it, the West's sphere of influence and bring it back into his. But essentially, Putin is also deeply pragmatic. He's aware that this is an exceedingly expensive, politically and economically, war for himself. And although this coming year is unfortunately looking quite good for the Russians, they have an advantage in terms of ammunition. The Ukrainians are probably going to have to spend the year essentially rebuilding after their rather unsuccessful counteroffensive and so forth. Once you start getting into 2025 and beyond, there's actually some real risks for the Russians. So I can see Putin thinking, well, this is a good time precisely to regard this as a high watermark of Russian occupation. Let's try and freeze it now through the medium of a ceasefire. If things change dramatically, then I can always break the ceasefire. It's not as though Putin regards himself as being sort of bound by these kind of agreements. But on the other hand, it also poses a great dilemma for the West. Because, let's be perfectly honest, not only are there many countries in the West that would frankly rather not be spending what it costs to support Ukraine, but also, particularly in Washington, there is a growing almost terror of what might happen were Donald Trump to win the presidency. And certainly for some people within the blob, I mean, I'm encountering it in my own conversations with officials there, is that sense of we can't let this war roll on until it becomes Donald Trump's playground. We actually have to reach some kind of a settlement before that point, which makes them really quite vulnerable to this kind of suasion from Moscow.
Oh, and I want to pull up the cover image here because I think it makes the point really well that when we talk about a peace deal, some kind of deal, a ceasefire, these words don't necessarily reflect reality. It has been a big talking point from the beginning of this conflict that agreeing to some sort of peace deal would legitimize Putin's terror and what he's done. But there's also a bigger question for Ukrainians about whether or not it just gives him more time to regroup and come back even stronger. When we talk about all of these options, whatever name we put on them, are we really talking about a safer world, particularly for Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, as Mark completely correctly has said and has argued for many years, the key feature of the Putin regime has always been this absolutely ruthless pragmatism and the fact that they constantly adapt to situations. And it's very hard to actually read any kind of grand strategy. Or let me put it differently. I mean, although a grand strategy may exist, there in the Kremlin, in Putin's mind, there are usually several such grand strategies running in parallel, and actually they just sort of chop and change between them all the time. We've seen that time and time again, over Georgia, over Syria, over Crimea, and so on. They basically, Putin will take whatever he can get. The problem is, the really fundamental difficulty is that a forever war does not favor Ukraine. So currently there's a major disconnect between the official position of Zelensky and his inner team, which is that we need to fight on till the end. We need to persuade the West to give the weapons that we need to fight the war, although in parentheses, it's not really clear, having had the weapons that they have, what further escalation is going to be required to actually achieve the goal of returning 1991 borders. I mean, that's a lot of equipment. But there's a fundamental disconnect between that Zelensky position that we need to keep fighting until Russia is defeated and the actual future of Ukraine, because actually, although the war, as Marcus said, is expensive, for Russia, it's still building up its military capabilities. It's getting stronger, I would say, not weaker, over time. And meanwhile, Ukraine is losing its main asset, tragically, which is its people. And Ukraine faces a terrible shortage of men to recruit for the front lines, and we already see some fractures appearing in Ukrainian society. So in a nutshell, you have a contradiction and a problem, because actually a long, endless war does not favor Ukraine. It probably favors Russia. And at the same time, the longer the war goes on, the longer Ukraine has to wait to actually reconstruct itself, reform itself, and sail off into its bright European future. None of that can happen until a ceasefire happens or until the conflict is somehow resolved.
Mark, what do you make of those comments that a longer war is more difficult for Ukraine? How likely is it that Ukraine could win back some of that remaining land? And do you think the Ukrainian people are ready to accept some kind of deal that doesn't include all of that land being returned?
When asked the straightforward up and down question of should we fight on until we have achieved victory being defined in terms of regaining all the occupied territories, a very clear majority of Ukrainians still say yes. But in some ways that's misleading, because that is, if nothing else, an appeal to patriotism. People know what the quote-unquote right answer is. What's interesting is I know there's been focus group work trying to talk to Ukrainians about particular objectives and essentially what would you think is an acceptable cost in terms of lives. And Owen is absolutely right. I mean, although the Russians have lost a lot more men, proportionate to population, Ukraine is suffering greater than the Russians. So, what do you think needs to be spent? And, when we look at, for example, Crimea, a lot of Ukrainians, frankly, are probably not thinking that it's worth the likely cost of regaining this peninsula, many of whose inhabitants, especially now that there's been about 1 million Russian colonists arriving, currently, many of whose inhabitants, therefore, actually want to be Russian rather than Ukrainian. I remember once talking to a Ukrainian interior minister official, fairly senior, who was concerned that basically he said Crimea could be our Northern Ireland. So, for all these reasons, one has to go beyond that overall sort of current determination to regain all the territory. I think that certainly in the West, but also amongst quite a few figures within Kyiv, there is a quiet awareness that someday some deal will be struck. The problems are two. One is no one wants to say so publicly for fear of being pilloried, especially so long as Zelensky himself is so fervently committed to a full maximalist kind of victory. But the second thing is, in some ways, no one wants to show their hand before any negotiations. The sense being, if you more or less admit that you, for example, might not want Crimea, then in a way the Russians would take as read, well, we've got Crimea, what else can we get? So this is the trouble. At the moment, in a way, it is waiting for someone to be the first person to make that kind of move. Putin thinks time is on his side, so he's not willing to do it. Zelensky also thinks, I think, time is on his side. So for that reason, neither of the leaders really at this moment are willing to make those kind of tough self-abnegating choices which negotiations will involve.
Owen, Mark just mentioned President Zelensky. What are his positions publicly, but perhaps more importantly, privately, on this issue of a deal?
Well, as far as I understand it, his private position is pretty much the same as his public position, is that they realize that there's a fatal cascade that begins in your war effort if you start to decide that you are talking. And once you announce that, you actually immediately basically pull the carpet in terms of morale and in terms of, no one wants to be, famously John Kerry said, no one wants to be the last man to die for a mistake. And that's the colossal problem for Zelensky in admitting any kind of negotiation. Furthermore, by the way, last October, Zelensky actually wrote into law that negotiations with the Putin regime was literally illegal. So he literally is not able to do that until he changes his own law. It's a kind of strange kind of thing to write into law, but nonetheless, Zelensky did it to signal his resolve, not one step back. But at the same time, you see growing discontent, or not discontent, but certainly like the return of politics, let's put it like that, in Kiev. And by a gigantic irony, the only thing that is actually keeping Zelensky, the main thing is keeping Zelensky popular and keeping Ukraine united is Putin's appalling attacks. Absent the Christmas and New Year bombardment, which has been among the heaviest of the war, you would actually see rather serious fissures and debates developing in Ukrainian society. And I just spent 3 weeks in Kiev, and I spoke to lots of people for current and former Zelensky senior ministers and advisors. And those who'd oppose him or who would, under normal circumstances, speak out, prefer not to, because it's пока не время. It's not the time to do it now that we're under attack. But there is actually a growing groundswell of opinion that Zelensky actually has mismanaged the war, and not that we should surrender, put up our hands and hand over the territories, but certainly there's some kind of compromise has to be reached with the Russians. And if you look, as Mark rightly said, the Ukrainian people's opinion, it all depends very much on the question you ask. Because if you ask a slightly different question, and it was asked at the beginning of December, do you think that some kind of compromise is necessary to end this war? Then 43% of Ukrainians surveyed by well-respected Kiev pollster said yes, and 46% no. So, clearly there's a very large minority of Ukrainians that are actually kind of willing to, not only willing to do a deal, but willing to publicly admit that a deal needs to be done.
Mark, last question. In his New Year's address, Putin didn't really mention his war in Ukraine. It seems like he wants to distract or even move on from the conflict when it comes to those kinds of public speeches. If there were some kind of a deal, we can pretty much assume that, regardless of what it looked like, money would be pouring into Ukraine from the West immediately to help it rebuild. We cannot say the same about the West's reaction to Russia. Would Putin be allowed to return to activity as usual, even if a peace deal were secured?
Well, look, there's no question that we'd return to some kind of status quo ante, even if there was some kind of, not just a ceasefire, but an actual peace deal. Probably we would see some kind of sanctions relief as a necessary part of that deal. But even so, essentially we're entering in a future in which, at least as long as Putin is in the Kremlin, there will be continued controls over the export of technology, over investment into Russia and so forth. We are heading back into a Cold War era in that respect. So, again, it won't just simply be a sort of kumbaya moment where we all just sort of pretend that this ghastly war never happened. But that said, I think from Putin's point of view, he is in a position in which actually he is constrained, I think, more by his own sense of his historic destiny, his place in sort of basically the pantheon of Russian state-building heroes, rather than pressure from below. It is not actually as if most Russians are sitting there saying, go back to the example that Owen gave, that Avdiivka must be ours. They don't want to lose, but but not wanting to be defeated is different from actually having some kind of clear objectives. If Putin were able to negotiate something that looked like a peace, and that looked like a peace from his point of view with honor, and remember, he controls the media, so he has considerable freedom to spin whatever happens as some kind of honorable success. If he can do that, then I think the Russian people will be quite accepting of that. But as I say, I think Putin himself in this respect is the constraint. He will know that it won't really be a victory. And I think he may well not feel that that is either politically survivable for him or the legacy that he wants to go down in history.
Owen and Mark, thanks so much for joining Spectator TV.